Good afternoon everyone, I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games, and today we are going to continue with our usual Wednesday poetry, prose and riddles stream. Now last week we had finished the section on the section which covered a selection of poems by Robert Burns in this anthology. So as usual, we will begin by reading the last poem that we read last week and then move on. So, O Mary, at thy window be, it is the wished, the trysted hour, those smiles and glances let me see, that make the miser's treasure pour. How blithely wad I bid the stour, a weary slave through sun to sun. Could I the rich reward secure, the lovely Mary Morrison? Yestreen, when to the trembling string, the dance god thro' the lighted ha, to thee my fancy took its wing, I sat but neither heard or saw. Though this was fair, and that was braw, and yon the toast of other town, I sighed and said among them all, ye are na Mary Morrison. Sorry, I can't. Seem to be doing rather a poor job of this. I sighed and said among them are, ye are na Mary Morrison. O Mary, canst thou wreck his peace, while for thy sake would gladly die, or canst thou break that heart of his, whose only fault is loving thee? If love for love thou wilt not give, at least be pity to me shown. Fort and gentle can it be, the fort o' Mary Morrison. So that was Robert Burns. As we've seen, his poems in general seem to be extremely romantic in nature, and this one is no exception. Nice in its way, though like a lot of his poems, a bit in your face in terms of their sentiments, but he was after all considered a pioneer of the romantic movement in poetry and art. So next we move on to Lord Byron. Now, let's find out a bit about him. George Gordon Byron, 6th Baron Byron. So 1788 to 1824, so died quite young. Simply known as Lord Byron, was an English poet and peer, one of the leading figures of the Romantic movement. Byron is regarded as one of the greatest English poets. He remains widely read and influential. Among his best-known works are the lengthy narratives Don Juan and Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Many of his shorter lyrics in Hebrew melodies also become popular. Oh, Jenny has shared a link, and she says, so sad. So, a link to Mary Morrison. Mary Morrison, or Mary Morrison, spelled with 2 R's, 1771 to June the 29th, 1791, so she'd have been around 20. May have been the lovely Mary Morrison, whom the poet Robert Burns admired as a girl of 16. She was daughter of Adjutant John Morrison of Mauchlin. I'm no doubt butchering that. Adjutant is a military appointment given to an officer who assists the commanding officer with unit administration, mostly the management of human resources in an army unit. The term adjutant is used in French-speaking armed forces as a non-commissioned... Okay, well that gives us an idea of what it was her father did. Her tombstone carries the inscription, in memory of Adjutant John Morrison, etc., etc., also his daughter, the poet Bonnie Mary Morrison, who died 29th of June 1791, aged 20, and his second spouse, etc. Life and character. Mary Morrison died young at the age of 20, being a victim of consumption in 1791. She's buried in Mauchlin churchyard. Hunter records that she had a foot amputated after a horse riding accident, therefore the cause of death may have actually been septicemia. She either lived at Brownlee at the east side of Castle Street, where it met with the No, and the other is the Place, which was the tenement that stood to the east of the cross. I probably shouldn't read this whole article out verbatim. Local tradition, however, records that she was not an intimate of the poet and may have actually met him only once during tea at a friend's house. The Reverend Dr. Edgar of Mauchlin is recorded to have said that Morrison's sister thought that identity of the Mary of the poet, Mary Morrison, was indeed her sibling. Most authorities feel that the name was used by Burns for Alison Begbie, as he called the song one of my juvenile works, which he was unlikely to say about a song written in 1784/5, when Mary would have been a girl of about 14 and 12 years younger than Burns himself. Oh. Yes, that is sad. Of course, death was a... Even today, obviously, death can often come as a surprise, but even more so back then, people would have been much more aware of the fact that you never really know when your time's up, and, you know, back then, a lot of people would have died young. Maybe not the majority of people, but it would have been quite common. Doesn't make it any less sad, of course, but certainly gives an impression of the world they lived in. Still, that was very interesting, Jenny. Jenny says, well, I'm aware that the introduction of Mary Morrison is not the focus of the discussion, but I think her experiences help us to understand the poet's emotional feelings towards her. Hard to say, because there was a suggestion that, as far as I read into it, that it may have been a coincidence of name. Of course, we don't know that for sure. Anyway, Lord Byron. Interesting. He travelled extensively across Europe, especially in Italy, where he lived for 7 years in the cities of Venice, Ravenna, and Pisa. During his stay in Italy, he frequently visited his friend and fellow poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Not sure how you pronounce the middle name. Later in life, Byron joined the Greek War of Independence, fighting the Ottoman Empire, and died leading a campaign during that war, for which the Greeks revere him as a folk hero. He died in 1824 at the age of 36 from a fever contracted after the first and second siege of Missolonghi. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. I apologise for my awful pronunciation. His only legitimate child, Ada Lovelace, is regarded as a founding figure in the field of computer programming based on her notes for Charles Babbage's analytical engine. I had heard of that. She was the inspiration for or at least the namesake for the Ada programming language, although I have no reason to believe that that the language itself was based on her notes. I suspect not. Byron's extramarital children include Allegra Byron, who died in childhood, and possibly Elizabeth Medora Ley, daughter of his half-sister, Augusta Ley. Well then. Still, we needn't go through the entire Wikipedia article, and if obviously people were interested, viewers were interested, they could do so themselves. They don't need me to read it out. But that gives us an impression of who he was, and importantly, when he lived. So I believe that makes him pre-Victorian. I've forgotten the date when Victoria took the throne. June 20th, 1837. So yes, he's pre-Victorian. So, the first poem by Lord Byron is She Walks in Beauty. So, we'll begin with a first reading, followed by looking up any words that give us difficulty. She walks in beauty like the night, of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. Thus mellowed to that tender light, which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace, which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. I can't help but think I butchered that a bit. Now, I don't think there are any words there that I had difficulty with. If anyone in chat had any difficulty with any words, let me know and we'll look them up. Tress, actually. I'm not sure what a tress is. A braid knot, a curl of hair, a ringlet, a long lock of hair. By extension, a knot or festoon as of flowers, which waves in every raven tress. So she has raven black hair, presumably, which is braided. Oh, Jenny says She Walks in Beauty seems to be a very famous poem. I found the Chinese version of it. I see. So, I noticed there's a clear rhyming scheme. It's an A B A B A B rhyming scheme. Is there a meter? So I believe the overwhelming majority of the lines contain 8 syllables. So that does open up the possibility of a meter, because I'm not familiar with meters with an irregular number of syllables on each line. There are some styles of poetry, such as the haiku, where different lines will have a different number of syllables, or moda, but none that are truly irregular. So I suppose the next thing to do is check the stress on each line to see if there is in fact a meter. I don't think there is. Because just starting at the beginning, she walks, they would both be stressed. And then you have, in beauty, which in wouldn't be stressed. Beau wouldn't, I don't think. I think the T would. Beauty. Yeah, the stress is on the T part. Then you've got like the, which wouldn't be stressed, then night that would. So we have stressed, stressed, not stressed, not stressed, stressed, not stressed, not stressed, stressed, which doesn't make up any meter I'm familiar with. So unless I'm rather misunderstanding the concept of meter, which is possible, I don't think there is one. But it's very notable that the syllables are consistent on lines, which will create a certain rhythm, and of course the rhyming scheme. Yeah, the exception to the 8 syllables per line seems to be the 4th line in the 2nd paragraph. Or more accurately, I think I mean to say, the 4th verse in the 2nd stanza. Or softly lightens o'er her face. That's 9. Unless the intention was that we in dropping the V from over, we actually allied it to the point of it becoming one vowel, which now I think about it, we probably are. So maybe that would be, as written, pronounced with 8 syllables as well. Or softly lightens o'er her face. Yeah, that's... No, I don't think so, but... It's hard to say, but... It's hard to say it without it being 2 syllables. I suppose. Whereas I think o'er is more likely with a short glottal stop in the middle. I'm not sure, to be honest. Still, I'll give it another reading. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. Thus mellowed to that tender light, which heaven's too gaudy day denies, one shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace, which waves in every raven tress, of softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express, how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days and goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. It's nice, but I feel that well, it is nice. I feel as though I need to think about it a little more than one might expect to fully grasp it, though. Perhaps that's just me. She walks in beauty like the night, so that makes sense. It's just creating a... It's comparing her beauty to the beauty of night, of cloudless, favourably comparing, of cloudless climes and starry skies, so that's describing the night, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. So the idea is that the idea being expressed is that she has a dark complexion, but her eyes are bright, thus mellow to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. So I think heaven in this case, even though it's capitalized, it's probably referring to the sky. I think when it says which heaven to gaudy day denies, means the sky denies to gaudy days, so overly bright and sunny days don't have as mellow a light. So, meet in her aspect and her eyes, so thus mellow to that tender light. I wonder if that's thus meant to be interpreted as thus mellowed in that tender light. Let's quickly look at mellow. soft or tender by reason or ripeness, having a tender pulp. Matured and smooth, and not acid, harsh or sharp. Chiefly poetic, mature of crops ready to be harvested, ripe, fruitful and warm. Not coarse, brash, harsh or rough, delicate, rich, soft, subdued. Senses relate to a person or their qualities, well matured from age or experience. Not impetuous or impulsive, calm, dignified, gentle. Cheerful, genial, jovial, merry, also easygoing, laid back, relaxed. Drunk, intoxicated, especially slightly or pleasantly so, or to an extent that makes one cheerful and friendly. And there is a US slang usage, but that wouldn't be being used here. I'm just trying to figure out how something can mellow to something else. Well, it's being used as a verb, isn't it? So what about the verb form? To cause fruit to become soft or tender, to cause to become matured, to soften and make it suitable for planting in, that would be soil. To reduce or remove the harshness or roughness from, to cause a person to become calmer, gentler and more understanding, particularly from age or expression. Oh, of course, because you say people mellow with age. The fervour of early feeling is tempered and mellowed by the ripeness of age. To cause a person to become slightly or pleasantly drunk or intoxicated. Yep. Okay. Thus mellow to that tender light. So yeah, I'm not sure how you can mellow to something. Also, the subject is of course implied here. But this, presumably, the subject must be her aspect and her eyes, since that's the last thing being discussed. So her aspect and her eyes mellow to that tender light. So I think what they're saying is her aspect and her eyes seem very mellow in the tender light. The tender light, of course, being light that's too soft for daytime. Because, of course, we have the theme of night and the metaphor of night that's being repeated and explored. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress. The only thing odd about that is I think the use of had there. I think it would make more sense if it was one shade the more, one ray the less. Would half impair the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, saying that any more shady or any more bright would impair the beauty which you see in her waving tresses of hair. I believe that's what they're saying, I could be wrong. Or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. So, both stating that she has sweet, serene thoughts, and also describes how pure and dear her beauty is, her facial structure. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent. So presumably he's describing her expression as soft, calm and eloquent, I would assume. Although, what does he mean by eloquent in this context? Because presumably he doesn't mean well spoken. Fluently persuasive and articulate, effective in expressing meaning by speech. Maybe he does, then. I'll go check my physical dictionary for eloquent to see if there's some meaning that we're missing here. Eloquence, fluent, forcible, and apt use of language, rhetoric, as professor of eloquence. Yep. Okay, well that certainly seems to confirm the meaning of the word in this context. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent. I can't think of a way to interpret that other than that she has a soft and calm complexion and she is eloquent. But that does seem slightly a slightly odd way of putting it. The smile that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. So again, it's just speaking of her virtues, both virtues in terms of beauty and virtues in terms of goodness of nature. So, how do we have any further comments about this poem? Anything that we'd both like to discuss? Anything we'd like to say about how the emotions that the poem induces or perhaps fails to induce? Anything like that before we move on to our final reading and then on to the next poem? Oh, Jenny said earlier, and I think I must have missed it, I know this is off topic, but I know some Chinese poems are turned into popular songs. What about English poems like the ones you talk about here? You'd think so, but to be honest, I don't know. Of course, poetry and songs, both, or at least Western music, both trace their roots back to the ancient Greeks, the music of the ancient Greeks, where they would play the lyre, hence where we get the word lyrical and lyrics, whilst singing a poetic song, and from that we both get the traditions of Western music and Western poetry. But in direct answer to your question, I don't know to what degree older poetry has been adapted to modern popular songs. I'm not particularly aware of that happening today, but I don't know. So, if there's nothing more to say about She Walks in Beauty, I will read it once more and we will move on. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellow to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place, and on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, foretell of days and goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. So, the next poem is named "Oh, Snatched Away in Beauty's Bloom." Oh, snatched away in beauty's bloom, on thee shall press no ponderous tomb, but on thy turf shall roses rear their leaves at the earliest of the year, and the wild cypress wave in tender gloom, and off by yon blue gushing stream shall sorrow lean her drooping head, and feed deep thought with many a dream, and lingering pause and lightly tread, fond a wretch, fond a wretch, as if her step disturbed the dead. Away, we know that tears are vain, that deaf nor heeds nor hears distress, or this unteaches to complain, or make one mourner weep the less. And thou who tell'st me to forget, thy looks are wan, thine eyes are wet. Sorry about that delay, just had some minor technical difficulties. So this poem clearly seems to be about the passing of a young person who was both beautiful and loved. This seems like a theme that we have seen repeated over and over in some of this poetry. I may actually adopt a bit of a faster style of moving through these poems for a while now, because we are noticing consistent themes throughout, and I'm not noticing things that are as notable or rather, because of the consistent themes, I'm not noticing as many interesting things to point out anymore. So, briefly, "Oh, snatched away in beauty's bloom," that's presumably the reference to death, "while still young and beautiful. On thee shall press no ponderous tomb," so this individual won't have a tomb, "but on thy turf shall roses rear." Roses, of course, famously a very beautiful flower, and also a symbol of love. "Their leaves the earliest of the year." To be honest, I'm not sure what that is referring to. I can't help but think that verse wouldn't be there if it wasn't conveying something that the poet wanted the reader to understand, but aside from it being a literal assertion of roses, leaves being the earliest in the year, which I certainly hadn't heard of, but might be true. I can't help but think that there's something there that I'm missing. And the wild cypress wave in tender gloom. So that's just trying to create romantic imagery of a grave, I'd suggest. And off by yon blue gushing stream shall sorrow lean her drooping head. So now we have imagery of a blue gushing stream, and he's anthropomorphizing the emotion of sorrow as if she were actually a person or deity, and feed deep thought with many a dream. That's interesting. And feed deep thought with many a dream. Does he mean dream in the sense of something that one aspires to, or dreaming? You'd think the former. And lingering pause and lightly tread, fond wretch, as if her step disturbed the dead. So this is all referring to sorrow. Shall sorrow lean her drooping head and feed deep thought with many a dream? Or maybe it means that the sorrow will induce dreams which will then lead to deep thought. That's possible. And lingering pause and lightly tread, fond wretch, as if her step disturbed the dead. So making people... I believe that is just a particularly imaginative way of describing someone treading softly because they're feeling sorrowful. Away we know that 'tis a vain, that deaf nor heeds nor hears distress. All this unteaches to complain, or make one mourn or weep the less. So we know that it doesn't, that weeping doesn't actually achieve anything, but will this change anything? And I think it's implied that the answer is no. And thou who tell'st me to forget, thy looks are wan, thine eyes are wet. I assume that's supposed to be pronounced Wayne, even though it's just W-A-N. Pale, sickly looking. One. It's one. And thou who tells me to forget, thy looks are wan, thy eyes are wet. Pale, sickly looking. So, I think the implication here is the person that tells me, the one who has experienced sorrow, to try and forget this person, presumably for their, I think it's implied for their sake, because clearly the sorrow is distressing them greatly. That person too is looking pale and sickly, and their eyes are wet, so they're also suffering too. Jenny says, I don't mean to be ironic, but it appears to me that this poet has seen a lot of beautiful women, or all women were beautiful in his eyes. Well, this is only the second poem of his we've read, Lord Byron, although I hardly think it's surprising for an individual to see a lot of women, in the sense of, you know, to socially be around a lot of women, unless you meant seen in the other sense. So yeah, this seems to be another poem exploring love lost, in this case due to death. I mean, that seems to be a very recurring theme in the poems in this anthology, either exploring requited love, unrequited love, or the death of a loved one, particularly a romantic, someone that you love in a romantic way. There have been a few more interesting ones, though. Well, I say more interesting, I mean more varied. There have been, for example, there was that poem by... I think it was Robert Browning, which seemed to indicate either a relationship that was being ended in a mutually agreeable way, or more likely it was referring to lovers being very, very careful about not getting caught. Unless I've misinterpreted it entirely, that's always possible too. I think that was The Lost Mistress by Robert Browning, if I recall correctly. And then there are poems like the Forsaken Merman, that was by Matthew Arnold, which was again about love lost, about and unrequited. Well, actually, it wasn't clear that it was about unrequited love, but clearly there had been a breakup. But that one was particularly interesting because it involved merpeople, fantastic creatures, which was a particularly imaginative way of exploring those emotions. Jenny, this article supports my view earlier. Byron and his women, mad, bad, and very dangerous to know. The greatest falsehood propagated about Byron is that he loved women. Well, I really wouldn't be surprised if, in fact, from the article when we looked at Lord Byron, it mentioned he had several illegitimate children. So I think it's clear that he was seeing several women in that sense over the course of his life. So that doesn't surprise me, but I wouldn't have concluded it just from those two poems. Still. Sorry, I was saying it's notable that he and Robert Burns both seem to be pioneers of the Romantic movement and seem to have had eventful love lives, shall we say. Anyway, as I say, I don't see much point on dwelling on this one any further. It's nice, but I'm not really seeing much of great import to point out. Oh, there's an A-B rhyming scheme again. Wait, is there? Bloom Tomb. Yeah, I apologise. There's an AABBCC rhyming scheme this time. No, it changes. Bloom Tomb, rear year, gloom. So that's AABBA. Stream, head, dream, tread, dead. So ABBB, vain, distress, complain less, forget wet. So that's ABABCC. So okay, it's actually, yeah, it has It follows a rhyming scheme, but it changes from stanza to stanza, so that is actually more interesting than I had noticed, and worth pointing out. But besides that, I think we should probably move on, unless there's anything anyone in chat would particularly like to discuss. Okay, we'll move on then. From the Corsair, which is a type of ship, I believe. Deep in my soul that tender secret dwells, lonely and lost to light for evermore, save when to thine heart responsive swells, then trembles into silence as before. There in its centre a sepulchral lamp burns the slow flame eternal but unseen, which not the darkness of despair can damp, though vain its ray as it had never been. Remember me, oh, pass not thou my grave, without one thought whose relics there recline. The only pang my blossom dare not brave must be to find forgetfulness in thine. My fondest, faintest, latest accents here, grief for the dead not virtue can reprove. Then give me all I ever asked, a tear, the first, last, sole reward of so much love. Okay, I think that's going to require a bit more analysis. Deep in my soul that tender secret dwells, lonely and lost to light for evermore, save when to thine my heart responsive swells, then trembles into silence as before. Okay, so there's some sort of secret that comes to light every time he thinks of the subject of this poem, and his heart swells responsively. There in its centre a sepulchral lamp. Now what does sepulchral mean? I believe that sepulchral may have religious connotations, relating to a grave or to death. Funereal, suggestive of a grave or death, gloomy, solemn, having a hollow and deep sound. Okay, not exactly. It relates to death and funerals, not to religion. From Latin sepulchrus, grave tomb. Oh, sepulchrum. Okay. There in the centre a sepulchral lamp burns a slow flame eternal but unseen, which not the darkness of despair can damp, though vain its ray as it had never been. So despair can't put out this slow eternal flame, but its ray had never been? Interesting. Now, vain I understand to mean hopeless or something which cannot be achieved. What? Oh yeah, it can also mean overly proud of oneself, especially concerning appearance, having a high opinion of one's own accomplishments with slight reason. Of course, it can also mean that. Having no real substance, value, importance, empty, void, worthless, unsatisfying. Affecting no purpose, pointless, futile. A vain toil, a vain attempt. Showy, ostentatious. From Latin vanus, empty. So, being conceited or being futile. Though vain its ray as it had never been. So does it mean its ray is futile, or its ray is conceited? Because being poetry, of course, you might describe something inanimate as having feelings. I think it probably means futile, that the ray that's coming from the lamp serves no purpose because it had never been. So I suppose this is a lamp that that slowly burns forever but doesn't produce any light. And it's a sepulchral lamp, so again the themes of death. Remember me, O pass not thou my grave, without one thought whose relics there recline. So the individual in the grave and their effects that they were buried with. The only pang my bosom dare not brave must be to find forgetfulness in thine. So I think that's saying the only thing that they cannot bear is the thought of being forgotten by the subject of this poem. So this sounds a lot like this is from the perspective of someone who has passed on, and it is about the person that once loved them. My fondest, faintest, latest accents here. Alright, now what do they mean by accents in this case? Emphasis or importance in general. Expressions in general speech, usually plural only. Probably in that sense then. My fondest, faintest, latest accents here, but something you express cannot be heard. Well, sorry, can't hear itself. Things you express could be heard, but the things you express can't hear. So I'm not sure what they mean by that. What Lord Byron means by that. My fondest, faintest, latest accents here. Grief for the dead, not virtue can reprove. Reprove. To express disapproval, to criticize, rebuke, or reprimand, to deny or reject. Grief for the dead, not virtue can reprove. So does that mean grief for the dead that virtue cannot deny? Then give me all I ever asked, a tear, the first last sole reward of so much love. So please cry for me, having since I have passed. So virtue cannot deny grief for the dead. So only someone who isn't virtuous could possibly not feel grief for the dead, I think. Yes. So it doesn't... I can't follow all of it, but most of it seems to be... yet another poem about love and death, with the slightly imaginative perspective of being told by the dead loved one, not by the living person speaking of the person that has passed on, although there was another poem of that nature that we read. think possibly it was Epilogue by Robert Browning. I could be misremembering. So, rhyming. Dwells and swells evermore before, so A-B-A-B. Lamp unseen, damp bean, A-B-A-B. Grave, recline, brave, thine, A-B-A-B. Hear, reprove, tear, love. Oh, love. Well, that can't be pronounced reprove, surely. Love, sorry. Reprove. That surely can't be pronounced reprove. And I doubt that's meant to be pronounced Louvre. Yeah, it's reprove. My fondest faint his latest accents here. Grief for the dead, not virtue can reprove. Then give me all I ever asked a tear, the first last sole reward of so much Louvre. But I think that is broadly speaking ABAB, even though that's a sight rhyme as opposed to a phonetic rhyme. So yeah, again, I don't think there's much more to discuss here. It's yet another poem about love and death. A nice one. So far I have quite liked the poems by Lord Byron, but very much following a theme we've already seen, which may be down to the poets, it may be down to the material these individual poets produced, it may be down to the anthology itself selecting poems of that sort from various poets, or it may be down to the taste of the time, which I think is quite likely. Even though this is quite a long period we're talking about, it stems from late Georgian times through Victorian times, it would seem. So is there any more to discuss about that poem or any other before we move on? I suppose not. So then we will move on to reading some more Pride and Prejudice. So I believe we're on to chapter 15, so we should probably recap what we had read so far. In chapter 1 we were introduced to the Bennet family, that is Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, Jane, and then their daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, also known as Kitty, and Lydia. That's from eldest to youngest. In chapter 2 we learn a bit about Mr. Bennet's sense of humour, in the way he enjoys keeping people playfully in the dark about certain things. In chapter 3 we learn more about Mr. Bennet's sense of humour, and I apologise, I should have mentioned that in chapter 1 we also learned that a Mr. Bingley is moving into Netherfield, which is a house near Longbourn where the Bennets live. And in chapter 2 we see more of Mr. Bennet's sense of humour in that he didn't tell his family. Oh, we mentioned chapter 2. I am doing a bad job of this, I apologise. But he keeps his family in the dark about having visited Mr. Bingley, that being an important step in the families becoming acquainted back in those days. In chapter 3 we see more of Mr. Bennet's sense of humour in that he doesn't provide an adequate description of Mr. Bingley to his family, where his mother and daughters are particularly interested because they think he may be a candidate for his daughters to marry, something which is very much on their minds. The Mr. Bennet's visit is returned by Mr. Bingley, because that's what you do when visited in those days, you return a visit. But his family still don't get to meet him because they spend the time in the study. They receive an invitation to a ball. They go, that is the Bennets. Mr. Bingley and his family go, that includes the Hursts. The Hursts being one of Mr. Bingley's sisters and her husband. A Mr. Darcy, who is a good friend of Mr. Bingley, also attends. He sits at the dancing, which means that there aren't enough partners to go around, which leads to Elizabeth, the second oldest Bennet sister, having to sit out. And then, when asked about this and urged to dance and having it pointed out to him that Elizabeth is available, Mr. Darcy indicates that he's not interested in dancing with her because she is not sufficiently she is too plain for him, and also points out that why would he dance with a woman who's clearly been turned down by another gentleman because she's sitting out, not of course taking account of the fact that it's because he was standing out that there weren't enough partners. So he slights her in public in that way. In chapter 4 we see Jane and Elizabeth talking about the events of the ball and the difference in character between Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. At this point Mr. Darcy, both because of the events that we just discussed and for other reasons, just seems as quite conceited and proud, and for that reason most people, not just the Bennets, seem to have a low opinion of him, despite how favourably he was received at first, being having a very noble mien and being apparently a handsome and cultured gentleman at first appearance. That we'll see. He seems to have lost all respect for those qualities now that those that attended the ball perceive him as being quite proud. In chapter 5 we meet the Lucases. One of the Lucas' daughters is Charlotte, who appears to be a very close friend of Elizabeth. They were in attendance at the ball, although that wasn't... I don't think that was particularly mentioned up to that point. In chapter 6, we find out that Mr. Darcy is in fact falling in love with Elizabeth, despite the previous events. In chapter 7, Catherine and Lydia travel to see Mrs. Phillips in Meryton, which is a nearby village, and find out that there are recently soldiers stationing there. Something which they take a great interest in, because of course they approve of the idea of men in uniform. Jane travels to Netherfield and falls ill. This is partly of her mother's intention, as Jane asked whether she could... Jane and Mr. Bingley seem to have an interest in each other, and that Mrs. Bennet would quite like to see them married together, so she hatches a plan that if she goes there and falls ill, she will have to stay the night at Netherfield, and then a romance might blossom between her and Mr. Bingley. That's her thinking. And so when Jane asks if she can use the carriage to go to Netherfield, her mother denies her that... denies her the carriage, which leads to her having to ride a horse to get to Netherfield, and then it rains, something which her mother predicted would happen. And she does in fact fall ill and have to stay the night. The following day, Elizabeth also being denied a carriage, decides to walk to Netherfield. Half the journey was on her own through various fields, and it's several miles away. In chapter 8, we find out that Elizabeth is being treated a bit as an odd one out at Netherfield, partly because she walked alone through fields, which was seen as dangerous and silly thing to do by most people there, most people at Netherfield. She also insists upon reading a book instead of playing cards with the others. We also learn a bit about Mr. Darcy's high standards regarding women, and after Mr. Hurst calls everyone to order, reminding them that they're supposed to be playing cards, not chatting. Thus, Elizabeth is returns. I don't remember if she returns to reading her book or not, but she's clearly, having gotten into a conversation, she's then pushed out of the social interactions, though she chose to read a book instead of play cards. Following that, it's decided that Mr. Jones, the local apotheker, will be sent for in the morning to look at Jane, who still hasn't improved much. Elizabeth also spends her night there. Mrs. Bennet visits Jane, and although she thinks she isn't doing too badly, i.e. her life isn't in danger, she claims she's too ill to move because she wants her to stay there as long as possible to encourage a relationship between her and Mr. Bingley. The apotheker visits and agrees that she shouldn't be moved due to her health. There are various discussions between the guests and the hosts at Netherfield, and Lydia pressures Mr. Bingley to keep his promise to hold a ball. Lydia is thinking of the soldiery and the fact that some of the officers will, of course, be invited to attend the ball, which she hopes to meet. In chapter 10, Jane is on the mend, and we learn more about the differences between Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy via the analogy of letter writing. Mr. Darcy's writing a letter, and the conversation moves towards how they approach letter writing differently. Darcy subsequently tries to dance with Elizabeth, although she turns him down. Whilst going for a walk with Mrs. Hurst, Elizabeth bumps into Miss Bingley and Mr. Darcy, and they end up joining the group, making three, which is enough people to comfortably walk the path, and then Elizabeth ends up partly being left out, but she seems happy to be left out even when Mr. Darcy suggests that they move somewhere else so that there's enough room for four, and she walks off on her own. In chapter 11, Jane has started to recover, or has recovered quite a lot. Miss Bingley tries to persuade Mr. Bingley not to hold the ball. I believe she had Mr. Darcy in mind, since he doesn't seem to enjoy balls, and Miss Bingley seems rather interested in Mr. Darcy. That doesn't work though. Miss Bingley, as in Mr. Bingley, is insistent upon holding the ball. Miss Bingley tries to catch Mr. Darcy's attention by doing a turn about the room and ropes Elizabeth in to join her, which fails. Mr. Darcy sees through it and is quite blunt about the fact, causing some offence. You know, the transparentness of their attempts, that is. Elizabeth writes in chapter 12. Elizabeth writes to her mother asking for the carriage so they can return home, which is refused as her mother wants Jane to stay longer. Although she doesn't give that reason, she obviously gives an excuse. Mr. Bingley tries to... and then Elizabeth is determined to go home, so she asks with Jane, and so she asks for the use of the Bingley carriage. And after many professions of concern, It's ultimately decided that their leaving should be deferred till the following morning. Mr. Bingley tries to persuade Jane to stay longer, but ultimately relents. The sisters return home after Sunday morning service, but their mother is not pleased. However, their father has especially missed them and noted how the evening conversation had lost much of its animation during their absence. In chapter 13, we find out that a gentleman will be visiting the Bennets, sorry. I do apologise, the Bennets. A gentleman will be visiting the Bennets, and this is in fact a cousin of Mr. Bennet, Mr. Collins, who is to inherit Longbourn, the house they live at, after Mr. Bennet passes on. We find out that Mr. Collins' father was on very poor terms with his nephew, Mr. Bennet, during their life, but that his father has passed on. We also find out that Mr. Collins has in fact been ordinated and is a priest, and that he is a patron, Lady Catherine de Burgh. In chapter 14, I believe the Mr. Collins actually turns up at the end of chapter 13, but in chapter 14 we get to see more of him interacting with the family. During dinner, we learn Mr. Collins lives near his patroness, and she has a sickly but noble daughter. We also learn that Mr. Bennet thinks Mr. Collins somewhat absurd, and that he's rather enjoying that fact. We also have a scene in which Mr. Collins professes that he never reads novels, because he doesn't consider them to be worthy literature. And we also see Mr. Collins being offended when Lydia interrupts him when he's barely more than 3 pages into a book of Fordyce's sermons. And he gives a short speech about how he finds it fascinating that these books, which are meant to... the people who would be best served by reading these books, that is, young ladies, in his opinion, are often the least interested. And finally, he offers himself as an antagonist to Mr. Bennet at backgammon. I should have said that this visit was all organised under the understanding that the two halves of the family are trying to put aside their differences and reunite, because of course Mr. Collins' father was on bad terms with Mr. Bennet, and with the whole Mr. Collins due to inherit the house, and then the daughters of Mr. Bennet potentially, not to mention his wife, potentially having nowhere to go were that to happen, there is some tension between the families. And Mr. Collins, this whole visit was precipitated by Mr. Collins writing to Mr. Bennet explaining the situation and that he wishes to extend an olive branch. So that brings us to where we are now, chapter 15. Jenny says, I have a question. Was lady a title in the past, e.g. Lady Jane Grey? What criteria, qualifications would a woman need to so as to be called a lady? It could be used as a title, or rather a form of address. It's the female equivalent of lord. So if any man held a title which would entitle him to be referred to as Lord so-and-so, like Lord Byron or Lord Tennyson, then a woman of equal rank would be called Lady so-and-so. In general, this would be any noble title. So if you had oh, I'm sorry, I can't think of the word. So if you held a chivalric rank, so you're a member of so that if you're a knight, for example, then you would be Sir So-and-so. Or, I think Dame is the equivalent of Sir, if I recall correctly. Yes. That appears to be the case. That is below nobility. The chivalric titles are below noble titles. So to be a lord or lady would mean that someone was of really quite high rank. They were members of the nobility. However, informally, often the term lady was also used not as a form of address, but also to describe a woman, and that would have been seen as describing a woman as a cultured person, someone of the gentry or above. So as far as I'm aware, I could be wrong about this, as far as I'm aware, you wouldn't have described the most lower class women as ladies, I don't think. But you could, but you might say, if you said a nice lady came to visit the other day, I think that would mean of gentry or above, but I could be wrong. It's certainly the case that nowadays lady is used for any woman, and I'm not sure at what point that changed. But that is a different usage of the word lady as to use it as a form of address. So Lady Byron, for example. Does that answer your question, Jenny? Jenny says yes, thank you. So, chapter 15. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by educational society, the greatest part of his life having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father, and though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms without forming at it any useful acquaintance. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him originally great humility of manner, but it was now a good deal counteracted by the self-conceit of a weak head living in retirement and the consequential feelings of early and unexpected prosperity. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh when the living of Hunsford was vacant, and the respect which he felt for her high rank and his veneration of her as his patroness, mingling with a very good opinion of himself, of his authority as a clergyman and his right as a rector, made him altogether a mixture of pride and obsequiousness, self-importance and humility. Obsequiousness. Servile compliance. Having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report. This was his plan of amends, of atonement, for inheriting their father's estate, and he thought it an excellent one, full of eligibility and suitableness, and excessively generous and disinterested on his own part. His plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views, so that would be Jane Bennet, because only the eldest daughter would be referred to as Miss, then the surname, or the younger daughters would have been referred to Miss, first name, surname. Although, as I think I've mentioned before, I don't know what happened once the eldest daughter gets married. I don't know if the younger daughters I don't know if the next eldest single daughter remains being called Miss first name last name, or if she effectively inherits being called Miss last name, because of course the daughter who marries will take the surname of her husband. So I don't know what happens in that case. But in this case, none of the Bennet daughters are married, so when it says Miss Bennet, that must be referring to Jane. So, his plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views, and established all his strictest notions of what was due to seniority, and for the first evening she was his settled choice. The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast, a conversation beginning with his parsonage house, and leading naturally to the avowal of his hopes that a mistress might be found for it at Longbourn, produced from her, amid very complacent smiles and general encouragement, a caution against the very lovely Jane he had fixed on. As to her younger daughters, she could not take upon her to say... As to her younger daughters, she could not take upon her to say, she could not possibly answer, but she did not know of any prepossession. Her eldest daughter, she must just mention, she felt it incumbent on her to hint, was likely to be very soon engaged. Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done. While Mrs. Bennet was stirring the... And it was soon done while Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire. Elizabeth, equally next to Jane in birth and beauty, succeeded her, of course. Mrs. Bennet treasured up the hint, and trusted that she might soon have 2 daughters married, and the man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now high in her good graces. Lydia's intention of walking to Meryton was not forgotten. Every sister except Mary agreed to go with her, and Mr. Collins was to attend them at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was most anxious to get rid of him and have his library to himself, for thither Mr. Collins had followed him after breakfast, and there he would continue, nominally engaged with one of the largest folios in the collection, but really talking to Mr. Bennet with little cessation of his house and garden at Hunsford. Such doings decomposed Mr. Bennet exceedingly. In his library he had been always sure of leisure and tranquillity, and though prepared, as he told Elizabeth, to meet with folly and conceit in every other room of the house, he was used to be free from them there. His civility, therefore, was most prompt in inviting Mr. Collins to join his daughters in their walk, and Mr. Collins, being in fact much better fitted for a walker than a reader, was extremely pleased to close his large book and go. In pompous nothings on his side, and civil assents of that of his cousins, their time passed till they entered Meryton. What do they mean by civil assents? To agree to a proposal. That makes sense. I don't think that means proposal in the marriage sense, mind you. I think they mean that he's being a little pompous and overbearing, and they're just agreeing along for reasons of civility, to get along socially, not because they actually agree with him. The attention of the younger ones was then no longer to be gained by him. Their eyes were immediately wandering up in the streets in the quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or a really new muslin in a shop window, could recall them. Now, muslin is a type of fabric, but I believe a muslin was also used to refer to an item of clothing. I'm trying to... I've forgotten which item of clothing though. Doesn't seem to have it here. I will check my physical dictionary. Muslin, kind of delicately woven cotton fabric for ladies' dresses, curtains, etc. This one also doesn't have it. I'm convinced, though, muslin was also used to refer to a particular item of clothing. I'm guessing a dress, but I could be wrong. Anyway, moving on. Nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or a really new muslin in a shop window could recall them. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man, whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with another officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny, concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air, all wondered who he could be, and Kitty and Lydia, determined if possible to find out, led the way across the street, under pretence of wanting something in an opposite shop, and fortunately had just gained the pavement when the two gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Mr. Denny addressed them directly, and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and he was happy to say had accepted a commission in their corps. This was exactly as it should be. Oh, that would be core, wouldn't it? I just mispronounced that, I think. Yes. Where was I? Sorry. Mr. Denny addressed them directly and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and he was happy to say he had accepted a commission in their corps. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favour. He had all the best part of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and a very pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation, a readiness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming, and the whole party was still standing and talking together very agreeably when the sound of horses drew their notice, and Darcy and Bingley were soon riding down the street. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the two gentlemen came directly towards them, and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and Miss Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn, on purpose to inquire after her. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger. And Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed colour, one looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. Deigned meaning lowered himself to do. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible to long to know. Oh, it was impossible not to long to know. In another minute, Mr. Bingley, but without seeming to have noticed what passed, took leave and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillip's house, and then made their bows. In spite of Miss Lydia's pressing entreaties that they should come in, and even in spite of Mrs. Phillips throwing up the parlour window and loudly seconding the invitation. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the two eldest, from their recent absence, were particularly welcome, and she was eagerly expressing her surprise at their sudden return home, which, as their own carriage had not fetched them, she should have known nothing about. If she had not happened to see Mr. Jones's shop boy in the street, who had told her that they were not to send any more drafts to Netherfield because because the Miss Bennets were come. Because the Miss Bennets were come away, when her civility was claimed towards Mr. Collins by Jane's introduction of him. She received him with her very best politeness, which he returned with as much more, apologising for his intrusion without any previous acquaintance with her, which he could not help flattering himself, however, might be justified by his relationship to the young ladies who introduced him to her notice. Mrs. Phillips was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding, for her contemplation of one stranger was soon put to an end by exclamations and inquiries about the other, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr. Denny had brought him from London, and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission in the Shire. She had been watching him the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would certainly have continued the occupation, but unluckily no one passed windows now except a few of the officers, who, in comparison with strangers, were become stupid, disagreeable fellows. Some of them were to dine with the Phillipses the next day, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham, and give him an invitation also, if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. This was agreed to, and Mrs. Phillips protested that they would have a nice, comfortable, noisy game of lottery tickets, which I believe is a card game, and a little bit of hot supper afterwards. The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apologies in quitting the room, and was assured with unwearying civility that they were perfectly needless. As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen, but though Jane would have defended either or both had they appeared to be in the wrong, she could no more explain such behaviour than her sister. Mr. Collins, on his return, highly gratified Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs. Phillips's manners and politeness. He protested that, except Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never seen a more elegant woman, for she had not only received him with the utmost civility, but even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown to her before. Something, he supposed, might be attributed to his connection with them, but yet had never met with so much attention in the whole course of his life. Chapter 16. As no objection was made to the young people's engagement with their aunt, and all Mr. Collins' scruples of leaving Mr. and Mrs. Bennet for a single evening during his visit were most steadily resisted, the coach conveyed him and his 5 cousins at a suitable hour to Meryton, and the girls had the pleasure of hearing, as they entered the drawing-room, that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation, and was then in the house. When this information was given, and they had all taken their seats, Mr. Collins was at leisure to look around him and admire, and he was so much struck with the size and furniture of the apartment that he declared he might almost have supposed himself in the small summer breakfast parlour at Rosings. Rosings. That's presumably a place the reader is expected to know. It's the residence of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Okay, his patroness. A comparison that did not at first convey much gratification, but when Mrs. Phillips understood from him what Rosings was, and who was its proprietor, when she had listened to the description of only one of Lady Catherine's drawing rooms, and found that the chimney piece alone had cost £800, she felt all the force of the compliment, and would hardly have resented a comparison with the housekeeper's room. In describing to her all the grandeur of Lady Catherine and her mansion, with occasional digressions in praise of his own humble abode and the improvements it was receiving, it was happily employed until the gentleman joined them, and he found in Mrs. Phillips a very attentive listener. His opinion of his consequence increased with what she heard, and who was resolving to retail it all among her neighbours as soon as she could. To the girls, who could not listen to their cousin, and had nothing to do but to wish for an instrument and examine their own indifferent imitations of china on the mantelpiece, The act of imitating a copy or simulating something that is not the real thing. Yes, that's what I would have thought. To follow, to model or pattern, to make a copy, counterpart or semblance. Yes, I'm not sure what they mean by that then. China, of course, being the China ware. To the girls who could not listen to their cousin, and who had nothing to do but wish for an instrument and examine their own indifferent imitations of china on the mantelpiece, the interval of waiting appeared very long. It was over at last, however. The gentleman did approach, and when Mr. Wickham walked into the room, Elizabeth felt that she had neither been seeing him before nor thinking of him since, with the smallest degree of unreasonable admiration. The officers of the shire were in general a very creditable, gentlemanlike set, and the best of them were of the present party, but Mr. Wickham was as far beyond them all in person, countenance, air, and walk, as they were superior to the broad-faced, stuffy Uncle Phillips, breathing port wine, who followed them into the room. Mr. Wickham was the happy man towards whom almost every female eye was turned, and Elizabeth was the happy woman by whom he finally seated himself, and the agreeable manner in which she immediately fell into conversation, though it was only on its being a wet night, made her feel that the commonest, dullest, most threadbare topic might be rendered interesting by the skill of the speaker. With such rivals for the notice of the fair as Mr. With such rivals for the notice of the fair as Mr. Wickham and the officers, Mr. Collins seemed to sink into insignificance. To the young ladies he certainly was nothing, but he was still at intervals a kind listener in Mrs. Phillips, and was by her watchfulness most abundantly supplied with coffee and muffin. When the card tables were placed, he had the opportunity of obliging her in turn by sitting down to whist. Whist being another card game. "I know little of the game at present," said he, "but I shall be glad to improve myself, for in my situation in life." Mrs. Phillips was glad for his compliance, but could not wait for his reason. Mr. Wickham did not play at whist, and with ready delight was he received at the other table between Elizabeth and Lydia. At first there seemed danger of Lydia's engrossing him entirely, for she was a most determined talker, but being likewise extremely fond of lottery tickets, she soon grew too much interested in the game, too eager in making bets and exclaiming after prizes to have attention for anyone in particular, allowing for the common demands of the game. Mr. Wickham was therefore at leisure to talk to Elizabeth, and she was very willing to hear him, though what she chiefly wished to hear she could not hope to be told, the history of his acquaintance with Mr. Darcy. She dared not even mention that gentleman. Her curiosity, however, was unexpectedly relieved. Mr. Wickham began the subject himself. He inquired how far Netherfield was from Meryton, and after receiving her answer, asked in a hesitating manner how long Mr. Darcy had been staying there. "About a month," said Elizabeth, and then, unwilling to let the subject drop, added, "He is a man of a very large property in Derbyshire, I understand." "Yes," replied Mr. Wickham, "his estate there is a noble one, a clear 10,000 per annum. You could not have met with a person more capable of giving you a certain information on that head than myself, for I have been connected with his family in a particular manner from infancy." Elizabeth could not but look surprised. "You may well be surprised, Miss Bennet, at such an assertion, after seeing, as you probably might, the very cold manner of our meeting yesterday. Are you much acquainted with Mr. Darcy? As much as I ever wished to be," cried Elizabeth very warmly. "I spent 4 days in the same house with him, and I think him very disagreeable." "I have no right to give my opinion," said Wickham, "as to his being agreeable or otherwise. I am not qualified to form one. I've known him too long and too well to be a fair judge. It is impossible for me to be impartial, but I believe your opinion of him would in general astonish, and perhaps you would not express it quite so strongly anywhere else. Here you are in my own family. Here you are in your own family. Upon my word, I say no more here than I might say in any other house in the neighbourhood except Netherfield. He is not at all liked in Hertfordshire. Everybody is disgusted with his pride. You will not find him more favourably spoken of by anyone." "I cannot pretend to be sorry," said Wickham, after a short interruption, "that he or that any man should not be estimated beyond their deserts. But with him, I believe it does not often happen. The world is blinded by his fortune and consequence, or frightened by his high and imposing manners, and sees him only as he chooses to be seen. I should take him, even on my slight acquaintance, to be an ill-tempered man." Wickham only shook his head. "I wonder," said he, at the next opportunity of speaking, "whether he is likely to be in this country much longer. I do not know at all, but I heard nothing of his going away when I was at Netherfield. I hope your plans in favour of the shire will not be affected by his being in the neighbourhood." "Oh no, it is not for me to be driven away by Mr. Darcy. If he wishes to avoid seeing me, he must go. We are not on friendly terms, and it always gives me pain to meet him, but I have no reason for avoiding him but what I might proclaim before all the world, a sense of very great ill-usage, and most painful regrets at his being what he is. His father, Miss Bennet, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best men that ever breathed, and the truest friend I ever had, and I can never be in company with this Mr. Darcy, without being grieved to the soul by 1,000 tender recollections. His behaviour to myself has been scandalous, but I verily believe I could forgive him anything and everything, rather than his disappointing the hopes and disgracing the memory of his father." Elizabeth found the interest of the subject increase, and listened with all her heart, but the delicacy of it prevented further inquiry. Mr. Wickham began to speak on more general topics: Meryton, the neighbourhood, the society, appearing highly pleased with all that he had yet seen, and speaking of the latter with gentle but very intelligible gallantry. "It was the prospect of constant society and good society," he added, "which was my chief inducement to enter the shire. I knew it was to be a most respectable, agreeable corps, and my friend Denny tempted me further by his account of their present quarters and the very great attentions and excellent acquaintances Meryton had procured them. Society, I own, is necessary to me. I have been a disappointed man, and my spirits will not bear solitude. I must have employment and society. A military life is not what I was intended for, but circumstances have now made it eligible. The church ought to have been my profession. I was brought up for the church, and I should at this time have been in the possession of a most valuable living, had it pleased the gentleman we were speaking of just now." "Indeed?" "Yes, the late Mr. Darcy bequeathed me the next presentation of the best living in his gift. He was my godfather and excessively attached to me. I cannot do justice to his kindness. He meant to provide for me amply, and thought he had done it, but when the living fell, it was given elsewhere." "Good heavens!" cried Elizabeth, "but how could that be? How could his will be disregarded? Why did you not seek legal redress?" "There was just such an informality in the terms of the bequest as to give me no hope from law. A man of honour could not have doubted the intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it, or to treat it as merely a conditional recommendation, and to assert that I had forfeited all claim to it by imprudence, by extravagance, imprudence, in short, anything or nothing. Certainty. I'll reread that quickly. A man of honour could not have doubted the intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it, or to treat it as merely a conditional recommendation, and to assert that I had forfeited all claim to it by extravagance, imprudence, in short, anything or nothing. Yes, I'm not sure I follow that line of reasoning either. Certain it is that the living became vacant 2 years ago, exactly as I was of an age to hold it, and that it was given to another man, and no less certain is it that I cannot accuse myself of having really done anything to deserve to lose it, of a warm, unguarded temper, and I may have spoken my opinion of him and to him too freely. I can recall nothing worse, but the fact is that we are very different sort of men, and he hates me. This is quite shocking. He deserves to be publicly disgraced. Some time or other he will be, but it shall not be by me. Till I forget his father, I can never defy or expose him. Elizabeth honoured him for such feelings, and thought him handsomer than ever as he expressed them. But what, said she, after a pause, can have been his motive? What could have induced him to behave so cruelly? A thorough determined dislike of me, a dislike which I cannot but attribute in some measure to jealousy. Had the late Mr. Darcy liked me less, his son might have borne with me better, but his father's uncommon attachment to me irritated him, I believe, very early in life. He had not a temper to bear the sort of competition in which we stood, the sort of preference which was often given me. I had not thought of Mr. Darcy so bad as this. Though I have never liked him, I had not thought so very ill of him. I had supposed him to be despising of his fellow creatures in general, but did not suspect him of descending to such malicious revenge, such injustice, such inhumanity as this. After a few minutes' reflection, however, she continued, I do remember his boasting one day at Netherfield of the implacability of his resentments, of his having an unforgiving temper. His disposition must be dreadful. I will not trust myself on the subject, replied Wickham. I can hardly be just to him. Elizabeth was again deep in thought, and after a time exclaimed, to treat in such a manner the godson, the friend, the favourite of his father, she could have added, a young man too, like you, whose very conscience may vouch for you being very amiable, but she contented herself with, and one too, who had probably been his companion from childhood, connected together, as I think you said, in the closest manner. We were born in the same parish, within the same park. The greatest part of our youth was passed together, inmates of the same house, sharing the same amusements, objects of the same parental care. My father began life in the profession which your uncle, Mr. Phillips, appears to do so much credit to, but he gave up everything to be of use to the late Mr. Darcy, and devoted all his time to the care of the Pemberley property. He was most highly esteemed by Mr. Darcy, a most intimate, confidential friend. Mr. Darcy often acknowledged himself to be under the greatest obligations to my father's active superintendence, and when, immediately before my father's death, Mr. Darcy gave him a voluntary promise of providing for me, I am convinced that he felt it to be as much a debt of gratitude to him as of his affection to myself. How strange, cried Elizabeth. How abominable. I wonder what the very pride of this Mr. Darcy has not made him just to you. If from no better motive that he should not have been too proud to be dishonest, for dishonesty I must call it. It is wonderful, replied Wickham, for almost all his actions may be traced to pride, and pride has often been his best friend. It has connected him nearer with the virtue than with any other feeling. But we are none of his consistent, and in his behaviour to me there were stronger impulses even than pride. But we are none of his consistent. It probably means compatible or accordant. So, for almost all his actions may be traced to pride, and pride had often been his best friend. It has connected him nearer with virtue than with any other feeling. But we are none of his consistent, and his behaviour to me there were stronger impulses even than pride. Can such an abominable pride as his ever done him good? Yes, it has often led him to be liberal and generous, to give his money freely, to display hospitality, to assist his tenants and relieve the poor. Family pride and filial pride, for he is very proud of what his family, or what his father was, have done this, not to appear to disgrace his family, to degenerate from the popular qualities, or lose the influence of the Pemberley house, is a powerful motive. He has also brotherly pride, which, with some brotherly affection, makes him a very kind and careful guardian of his sister, and you'll hear him generally cried up as the most attentive and best of brothers. What sort of girl is Miss Darcy? He shook his head. I wish I could call her amiable. It gives me pain to speak ill of her, Darcy, but she is too much like a brother. Very, very proud. As a child she was affectionate and pleasing, and extremely fond of me, and I've devoted hours and hours to her amusement, but she is nothing to me now. She is a handsome girl, about 15 or 16, and, I understand, highly accomplished. Since her father's death her home has been London, where a lady lives with her, and superintends her education. After many pauses and many trials of other subjects, Elizabeth could not help reverting once more to the first, and saying, I am astonished at his intimacy with Mr. Bingley. How can Mr. Bingley, who seems good humour itself, and is, I believe, truly amiable, be in friendship with such a man? How can they suit each other? Do you know Mr. Bingley? Not at all. He is a sweet-tempered, amiable, charming man. He cannot know what Darcy is. Probably not. But Mr. Darcy can please where he chooses. He does not want abilities. He can be a conversable companion if he thinks it worth his while. Among those who are at all his equals in consequence, he is a very different man from what he is to the less prosperous. His pride never deserts him. But with the rich he is a liberal-minded, just, sincere, rational, honourable, and perhaps agreeable, allowing something for fortune and figure. The whist party soon afterwards breaking up, the players gathered round the other table, and Mr. Collins took his station between his cousin Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips. The usual inquiries as to his success were made by the latter. It had not been very great, he had lost every point, but when Mrs. Phillips began to express her concern thereupon, he assured her with much earnest gravity that it was not of the least importance, that he considered the money as a mere trifle, and begged that she would not make herself uneasy. I know very well, madam, said he, that when persons sit down on a card table they must take their chances of these things, and happily I am not in such circumstances as to make 5 shillings any object. There are undoubtedly many who could not say the same, but thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh I am removed far beyond the necessity of regarding little matters. This is incidentally a massive humble brag. He, if that wasn't at all clear. It's something that was particularly seen as a property of those of good breeding and higher birth, that they wouldn't quibble about money. That is historically speaking, and this is just such an example of that. He's being very obvious in being overtly humble. Mr. Wickham's attention was caught, and after observing Mr. Collins for a few moments, he asked Elizabeth in a low voice whether her relation was very intimately acquainted with the family of de Bourgh. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she replied, has very lately given him a living. I hardly know how Mr. Collins was first introduced to her notice, but he certainly has not known her long. You know, of course, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters, consequently that she is aunt to the present Mr. Darcy. No, indeed, I did not. I knew nothing at all of Lady Catherine's connections. I never heard of her existence till the day before yesterday. Her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will have a very large fortune, and it is believed that she and her cousin will unite the 2 estates. This information made Elizabeth smile, as she thought of poor Miss Bingley. Vain, indeed, must be all her attentions, vain and useless her affection for his sister, and her praise of himself, if she were already self-destined for another? Mr. Collins, said she, speaks highly both of Lady Catherine and her daughter, but from some particulars that he has related of her ladyship, I suspect his gratitude misleads him, and that in spite of her being his patroness, she is an arrogant, conceited woman. I believe her to be both in great degree. I believe her to be both in great degree, replied Wickham. Sorry, let me reread that. Mr. Collins, said she, speaks highly both of Lady Catherine and her daughter, but from some particulars that he has related of her ladyship, I suspect his gratitude misleads him, and that in spite of her being his patroness, she is an arrogant, conceited woman. I believe her to be both in a great degree, replied Wickham. I have not seen her for many years, but I am very well remember that I never liked her, and that her manners were dictatorial and insolent. She has a reputation of being remarkably sensible and clever, but I rather believe she derives part of her abilities from her rank and fortune, part from her authoritative manner, and the rest from the pride of her nephew, who chooses that everyone connected with him should have an understanding of the first class. I believe the first class in this case is referring to something of superior quality, and in this specific case, I think it's referring to being well acquainted with superior behaviour and habits, as well as possibly other information that would be associated with someone of good breeding. Could be wrong. Elizabeth allowed that he had given a very rational account of it, and they continued talking together with mutual satisfaction till supper put an end to cards, and gave the rest of the ladies their share of Mr. Wickham's attentions. There could be no conversation in the noise of Mrs. Phillips's supper party, but his manners recommended him to everybody. Whatever he said was said well, and whatever he did, done gracefully. Elizabeth went away with her head full of him. She could think of nothing but of Mr. Wickham and of what he had told her, all the way home, but there was not time for her even to mention his name as they went, for neither Lydia nor Mr. Collins were once silent. Lydia talked incessantly of lottery tickets, of the fish she had lost and the fish she had won, and Mr. Collins, in describing the severity of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, protesting he did not in the least regard his losses at whist, enumerating all the dishes at supper, and repeatedly fearing that he crowded his cousins, had more to say than he could well manage before the carriage stopped at Longbourn House. So, that was chapter 15. Is there anything anyone would like to discuss about it at this point? Or shall we move on to riddles? Okay, we'll move on to riddles then. So the last riddle that we looked at last week was 35, I believe. Every lady in every land has 20 nails on each hand, 5 and 20 on hands and feet. All this is true without deceit. The solution to this is to notice where the punctuation is, because there's a temptation to have an imagined stop at the end of each line. In fact, it says every lady in every land has 20 nails. On each hand 5, and 20 on hands and feet. All this is true without deceit. And so that's the solution to the riddle. It's to realise the proper reading of it, which is clearly true, as the final line stresses. So, 36. Oh, I think we may have done this one actually. Without my aid, no nymph is truly fair, nor could you ever find a happy pair. In cursed rebellion me the head you'll find, to murder, cruelty, and rage inclined. Yet virtue's friend will surely must agree, since even religion's self must cease with me. Thus you perceive I'm not devoid of grace, yet never in heaven or hell shall I have place. Though in the centre of the earth I'm pent, though my power subsists each element, though on my aid myriads of worlds depend, ladies, you'll find me at your fingers' end. And the answer to that one was the letter R. Which, well, I won't go through the explaining each line in detail as I did last week, but you'll find that every line makes sense if you realise that the answer is in fact the letter R. So I think that was the one we finished on. So, 37. A friend and an enemy, a blessing and a curse, saves life and takes it away, is long and short, round and square, rough and smooth, straight and crooked, hard and soft, hot and cold, most wanted where it is in the greatest plenty, it accommodates itself to all palates, sweet and of bad smell, strong and weak, sometimes able to bear the greatest burdens, at other times will not bear a pin. For this men make long journeys, though they have it in the greatest plenty at home. It is subject to reflection, and has the power of dissolving matrimony. It has the privilege to kiss the lips of the fairest ladies, assist them in dressing, and is highly instrumental towards improving their charms. It is subservient and overbearing, deaf and an antidote, causes famine in plenty, is a fluid and a solid, a mountain and a valley, has a numerous offspring, yet is an enemy to children, the subject of miracles, a theme of poets, an improvement of music, a great use in fortifications, employed in the finest paintings, and produces the noblest architecture in the world. Goodness. I wonder what that could be. Jenny says, I guess water for 21. That 21 is the page number. This is riddle 37. Yeah, I'm not convinced. Like, for example, it has the power of dissolving matrimony. I don't see why you would attribute that to water. It does cause famine and plenty, though. It's a fluid and a solid. Well, it can change state. It can be ice. It's not really a mountain and a valley, but I suppose you could have an icy valley or an icy mountain. An enemy to children? I suppose you could make that argument. An improvement of music? Well, I'm not sure how water would be that. Most wanted where it's in greatest plenty. And For this men make long journeys, as Jenny points out. Yeah, I'm not convinced by it being water. If you pour different amounts of water into identical glasses, then hit them with a stick gently, of course, you can play a song. I mean, I suppose, but I'm not sure I would call it. What was the exact phrase? Highly instrumental towards improve. Oh no, wrong one. An improvement of music. Well, I can't think of a better solution, so we may as well try it and see. See if it's water. It is in fact water. I feel as though the explanation for some of these have been lost. Okay, let's try. Oh, well done, Jenny, by the way. Let's try 38. ICUBYYFORME. Jenny says, what does ICUBYYFORME mean? That's the question. Jenny has said, I see you to be too wise for me. And she's posted a link, so I assume she found the answer on the internet. So that's probably the solution. Though I would rather you not look up the answers, Jenny. Tends to ruin the fun of the game. I see you be too wise for me. Yeah. So, 39. The following letters were written under the Ten Commandments in a Welsh church, the meaning of which remained undiscovered above a century. PRSVRY PRFCTMN VRKPTHSPRCPTSTN. Now, I am dubious that we're going to get this one at all. So let's begin by looking up the Ten Commandments, because I do not have them memorized, as sacrilegious as that may sound. Okay, so I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. That appears to be the first one in. I suppose that this would be the Roman Catholic Church. No. What am I talking about? That's complete rubbish. This was well past the Reformation. This would be the Lutheran version, I assume. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honour my father and thy mother. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbour. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife, or his slaves, or his animals, or anything of thy neighbour. Yes, despite what I just said, Jenny, I have a distinct feeling I am going to end up having to look this one up, because I really doubt I'm going to be able to figure this one out. Any ideas? Okay, I'm gonna look this one up. It's regrettable. I do enjoy doing these riddles, but I really don't think I have the slightest chance of getting that one. Persevere, yet ye perfect man, ever keep these precepts 10. Oh, they've put dots where the vowels would be. And they've not used... Oh, I suppose the clue should have been where they had the double. Full stop. I wonder what the significance of the commas are. I would not have got that. Oh, Jane says, what does this answer mean? This says, persevere, ye perfect man, ever keep these precepts 10. Oh, it can't be as simple as using full stops where there are vowels, because they've got 2 full stops there, even though there's only 1 vowel there. So I wonder if there's no difference between the commas and the full stops, or if there's an additional level of code that I'm not understanding. But in any case, that's all it is. It's an abbreviated... Oh, Jane says, I know, but I mean I don't understand the meaning of the answer. Well, persevere, ye perfect man. Persevere means, obviously, to keep trying, keep working hard. Gambaro. Ye perfect man, so a reference to the fact that man is considered to be made in God's image and therefore perfect. So I suppose you could say that's also encouraging people to stay virtuous. Ever keep these precepts 10. So these precepts 10 being the 10 commandments, and ever keep means never break. So it says, come on, keep trying. Don't break the 10 commandments. Anyway, that was that one. I mean, I feel a bit silly now. You'd have thought, in retrospect, that I should have tried filling in vowels. But I also think the chance of my having got that is slim. Oh well. It's a bit moot now whether or not I should have tried harder. I've looked it up. So, 40. There was a man of Adam's race who had a certain dwelling place. 'Twas so complete and covered over, no man since dwelt there or before. Neither of wood or stone was made, nor in the fabric brick was laid. 'Twas so contrived and put together, as him to screen from wind and weather. 'Twas not in heaven, or earth, or hell. Then tell me where this man did dwell. Jane says, okay, that means we should try hard to defend the 10 commandments. Essentially, yes, although I think it's more of it's slightly more personal than that. It's directing the readers specifically to try hard to keep them, rather than to defend them in general, I think. But yes, I'd say you're there. Could it be referring to Noah's Ark? I mean, you could argue that's on Earth, or you could take the view that... Oh no, because it says neither wood or stone was made. Okay, can't be the Ark. I was going to say you could take the view that Earth is the physical Earth, as in soil, as opposed to the planet Earth. But no. The man's name was Jonah from the Bible and the Quran, and he had lived in the belly of the whale. Yeah, I was wondering if it could be Jonah. But the thing that made me doubt that was, again, the fact that it's not in Earth. Or I suppose on Earth. Because the whale was still in the ocean, which is Earth. But again, you could make the argument that they meant Earth as in soil as opposed to the planet Earth. But it's just if someone says not in heaven, earth or hell, I assume that that wouldn't include the ocean. Okay, we'll have a look and see if that's it then. I mean, it's plausible and we both thought of it. Jonah in the whale. That was it. Yeah, I feel it's a bit misleading to say it wasn't on Earth, but I suppose that's just an example of how language has changed. Okay, 41. A word that's oft used and entailed on mankind, not one ever escapes it, the rich, lame or blind, it will quench a high fever and put out a flame, to warriors and poets will give them their due fame. 'Tis odd yet 'tis even, and yet it is neither, exposed to all winds and in all kinds of weather. A word that oft used and entailed on mankind, not one ever escapes it, the rich, lame or blind, it will quench a high fever and put out a flame. To warriors and poets will give their due fame, 'tis odd yet 'tis even, and yet it is neither, exposed to all winds and in all kinds of weather. See, up until the last two lines, I was wondering if the answer could be death. A word that's oft used and entailed on mankind, no one ever escapes it, the rich, lame or blind, it will quench a high fever and put out a flame. 'Tis to warriors and poets will give their due fame. Death would make sense. Then it says, 'tis odd yet 'tis even, and yet it is neither. Well, I assume they don't mean in the sense of a number, so what could they mean? 'Tis odd. 'Tis an odd thing, but even in the sense that it is fair, happens to all perhaps, and yet it is neither, exposed to all winds and in all kinds of weather. Oh, yet it is neither exposed to all winds and in all kinds of weather? No, I don't think so. I think the answer is probably death, although I don't fully understand the significance of the last two sentences, last two lines, sorry. What do you think? Chat. Well, I'll look it up if there are no. Jenny says a coachman. I'm not sure I follow that. Could you elaborate? I just think all the people there at the rich lane blind need a coachman. I don't think so. I'd be surprised if that's the solution. Of course, only rich people would have had coachmen anyway. Time. Of course it is. Although the last two lines still don't fully make sense. Yeah, but the rest of it also all makes sense. Perhaps more so. Okay, let's finish with 41 then. There is a certain natural production, neither animal, vegetable, nor mineral. It exists upon the surface of the earth from 2 feet to 6. It is neither male nor female, but between both. It is often mentioned in the Old Testament and strongly recommended in the New. What could they mean by it's neither male nor female between them both, but between them both? Because only animals and vegetables surely could it be described as being male or female, or at least living, or at least some form of life. I suppose nowadays we'd describe things like plugs as being male or female, among other things, but that's not something that's natural. From 2 feet to 6. Jenny said enigma, natural enough. I'm not sure I follow you. What do you mean? Enigma. Enigma means mystery. enigma exists even if people don't create them. I don't see how an enigma is between 2 to 6 feet. Nor how it could exist upon the surface of the earth. I mean, an enigma being a mystery really requires an observer, surely. And how is an enigma recommended in the New Testament? I'm not sure I follow you. I'm wondering if it could be something like water, snow, or air, or something like that. Something of that ilk. I mean, it can't be water, because water isn't always between 2 to 6 feet, and it can't be air. Snow seems unlikely, because it can certainly be less than 2 feet, and I don't see how it could be seen as being male or female. But those are things you'd naturally find on the Earth's surface which aren't animal, vegetable, or mineral. But it's strange that it would... Of course, we don't know what the measurement represents. It says 2 feet to 6, but... Of what? Length? Height? Depth? Something else? But for it to have some sort of minimum and maximum is very odd. Fire, maybe? I don't see why it would have a minimum of 2 feet though, and a maximum of 6. But I could see how they could view it as reproducing despite being male or female. Neither male nor female. And it certainly would be mentioned in the Old Testament. I'm not sure how it would be recommended in the New, though. Lightning is another naturally occurring phenomenon, which is neither animal, mineral, nor vegetable. But that's not between 2 to 6 feet, necessarily. But it'd be very odd for it to be. Smoke, similarly. I don't see why it'd be between 2 to 6 feet, but it's naturally occurring. And so otherwise would fit the bill. It's so odd for it to have both a minimum and maximum length, though. Like, what sort of naturally occurring thing, which isn't alive, could you really guarantee it will never be smaller than a certain length and never be larger than a certain length? And if it weren't for the neither male nor female, but between the both, you could always guess man. I mean, strictly speaking, when we're very young, we are less than 2 feet, but... that would make some sense. An angel? Could they mean an angel? But then again, why 2 to 6 feet? That is so specific. I think an angel is the best guess I've got. They were supposed to be neither male nor female. I suppose the 2 to 6 feet could be in reference to man, assuming they're of a similar size. Not sure what I mean by strongly recommended in the New Testament, though. I must have been recommended in the sense of being strongly commended. Thoughts? Okay, I'll look this one up. So I'm guessing angel, even though I'm not confident. Could be demon, equally. Love? Oh, but it's between both. As in between male and female. Love is experienced between a male and a female. But where does 2 to 6 feet come from? I do not understand that. I find that completely bamboozling. Oh well. That's the answer anyway. Love, apparently. I wonder if from 2 feet to 6 has some other meaning other than length that I'm just not seeing. Oh well. So, thank you for coming to the stream, everyone. I will be streaming again on Friday when I'll be playing some more Black Skylands, which is a very interesting and fun early access game. Then I will be streaming again on Monday when I'll be continuing Monkey Island 3, The Curse of Monkey Island. Then, which is also a very interesting game. And then Wednesday it will be back round to my poetry, prose and riddles stream. If I choose to stream in addition to that, I will announce it on Twitter. So once again, thank you for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful night.